Well, hi, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. Welcome wherever you happen to be. I really am glad you're here with us. I'm Mike Hingson, your host. Today, our guest is Wallace Pond, a man of many talents. He's been very much involved in helping people in transforming. Um, he's got bachelor's, master's, and PhDs well, I won't say all over the place, but he has a number of degrees. Yeah, we won't give them all away. I'll let you do that. And he's also now even becoming involved in more things relating to psychotherapy. So I'll have to have him talk to my cat and see if we can do something. Yeah, never sure that works, does it, Wallace? But anyway, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's just a pleasure to be on the show with you. I appreciate you reaching out to me previously, and really appreciate also kind of the work that you do and what you've accomplished. And I think you have a really healthy and helpful perspective on a number of things, in particular diversity. But I think needs to be that more people need to hear. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and would love to work with you any way that we can. Why don't we start on your podcast episode by you telling us kind of maybe a little bit about the early Wallace growing up and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So I was born in the Deep South in the early 1960s. Very different time. My father was in the Air Force. So even though we were in Alabama, I was born into a desegregated military environment. In Montgomery, Alabama, the city was not desegregated. There were still separate bathrooms and water fountains for, quote, colored people.
Yeah.
But on the Air Force Base, it was at least as desegregated as the military could be at that time. But my folks and my family, both from Idaho, of all places, when my son was born there about 30 years ago, he was the fifth generation from Idaho. My folks went back to Idaho when I was about, 9 years old.
So was it the military, though, that influenced you not to have an Alabama accent?
Yeah, probably parents and military both.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so my little sister and I, we were in Alabama and Georgia, Maryland, before we went back to Idaho. But yeah, we sort of never got that Southern accent. Although, given an opportunity, I can slip into it.
I hear you.
And I certainly recognize it.
Yeah. Well, and I love to use the words y'all and all y'all, and I know the difference between the two, which a lot of people don't. But it's a
there's a third. There's a third, which is the plural possessive, all y'alls.
Oh, all y'alls. That's right.
Yeah. Which not everybody, which you don't hear all the time, but definitely here in the South.
Yeah. I love language. Anyway, so you were saying, so
so moved out to Idaho, back to Idaho. That's where my folks were from. And kind of feel like some really formative years, 9 to probably 18 or so in Idaho. And just had the great pleasure over both when I was a child living with my parents, and then also once I was independent out of the home. Probably lived in, I could calculate it, but lived in probably a dozen states, half a dozen countries, visited 39 or 40 countries. So just one of those people, some folks, one model is to kind of grow up somewhere and be from there. And that's, kind of how you identify. And then there's other folks like I who just, it's a very different perspective, and it's, a lot of moves, a lot of different experiences. I think my wife and I, we've been married 34 years, and we stopped moving quite so much in the last, probably 15, but I think we've moved 11 times. And in fact, the last kind of big adventure was we spent a couple of years over in the United Arab Emirates. I was the CEO running a company over there, as well as a college president at the same time, doing both in Abu Dhabi. And that's kind of a long arc
It
got me to
is.
where I am now. But there was kind of a lot of K-12 experience, university experience, corporate experience. So pretty kind of broad-based, personal and professional background. And as you said, I more recently got into the field of psychotherapy as an actual therapist. That was kind of an interesting career shift, but really timely and probably one of the most congruent decisions I've ever made in my life in terms of making a life decision that turned out to align with what I wanted to be true and what was making sense for me at the time. So kind of a long arc, but here we are.
Here we are. Where did you go to college?
Yeah, so initially, University of Utah.
Okay.
And I pursued a degree in Spanish and Hispanic literature, which also kind of was not purposeful. It wasn't part of a plan, but it really had a significant impact on some of the things I did in my life, and certainly some of the cultural experiences I had. As a student, I lived in Spain and Mexico as well. And then as a professional and as an adult, I also lived in Puerto Rico for 3 years. So Spanish and Spanish culture are kind of a big part, at least earlier in my career, up through probably, I think I left Puerto Rico in 2013 after 3 years there. So that was kind of the undergraduate, and then, as you mentioned, I have three different graduate degrees, two masters and a PhD, and the one at Boston University, that was back in the 90s, and then a PhD in education, and then I went back to school for the fourth time about 3 or 4 years ago, when I decided I wanted to go into the helping professions again and be a counselor. And so that was a master's in clinical mental health. And I've been practicing, I've been seeing clients for about 3 years. I've been seeing clients post-grad in both private practice and in a community health setting now for, I graduated in July of last year. So I probably, maybe a little over 1,200, 1,300 hours of counseling at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the educational story.
Well, I have to ask, since we talked about language and you spent some time at Boston University, and so on, did you ever learn to talk Bostonian?
So kind of like my experience in the South.
You can do it.
I can slip into it. I actually kind of enjoy it. I
do too.
But no, it's not something that I ever adopted for myself.
I lived in Winthrop, Mass for 3 years, so I spent some time in the Boston area.
And thoroughly enjoyed it. Great town. I loved Boston. I did a lot of that work actually overseas in an overseas program in Germany, of all places. So it's kind of a long, winding road.
I've heard that one of my favorite restaurants in Boston closed around or just before the time of the pandemic, Durgan Park at near Faneuil Hall. Quincy Market. I heard that Durgan closed.
Yeah, and that was not unique to them. I mean, the pandemic was pretty rough on restaurants. Mm-hmm. And a substantial number all over the country didn't make it through that. Yeah,
it's kind of sad. Long before the pandemic, the Carnegie Deli in New York closed, which was one of my favorites, and I knew the owner. But I think, and I don't even think they can. I don't even think they mail order anymore.
I don't know, but I do remember. Have some experience with the Carnegie Deli because that's where I was introduced to pastrami.
No better place.
Yes, and I didn't know I was a pastrami fan until then.
And the sandwiches were so small.
Yeah, well, right. Yeah, it was a workout, like doing curls, lifting the sandwich. But unfortunately, one of the things that happened being introduced to pastrami at the Carnegie Deli was I became kind of a pastrami snob. And so, that my first introduction was as good as it gets. So
Yeah.
it's hard for me for pastrami to match up since then, but gosh, that
It
was a while
is.
ago.
Oh, it is. It's really hard. I'm still spoiled by the first Caesar salad I ever had. When my wife and I got married, we spent part of our time in Palm Springs, and then we went and spent the rest of our honeymoon in Phoenix, and went to a hotel and stayed at a hotel called the Point Tapatio,
Mm,
which had a restaurant up on top of the mountain. On one side, you could see Phoenix. On the other side, you could see Scottsdale.
mm,
And we ordered Caesar salads that they made at tableside. And back then in 1982, it
right.
included the raw egg and everything else. And it's still the best
Yeah.
Caesar salad I ever had.
Yeah. Well, most people alive today or young with, I would say most people born since maybe 1980 or so, have, there used to be raw egg in a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember Orange Julius in
Oh,
those days.
yes.
Yeah, they used to get a raw egg was one of the ingredients you could get beat up in a smoothie.
Yeah.
Yeah, those days are sure gone.
Oh, the days. Well, Stephen, so what did you I was going to say what did you do after college, but that's really kind of hard because there's a lot of after colleges for you, but you said Spanish wasn't really part of the plan, but yet that's what you did for an undergraduate degree. How come?
Yeah, so this is kind of a funny thing to even admit, but well, actually, let me back up a step. So my father, he had some kind of intuition, some kind of insight. He really believed it would be helpful for me, maybe really in terms of life experience, maybe in terms of just a skill set to be bilingual. And even
Mm.
back in high school, he started like I'd come home and he'd put like a pamphlet on my bed about, Spanish language or Spanish class or something like that. And when I got to the University of Utah, I thought, a little bit based upon his, suggestions and support. I took a few Spanish. I remember taking, Spanish 101. Then I kind of liked that Spanish 102. Um, I was a communications major at the time, and to be honest, I still don't know what that means, Mike. But I was a communications major, and at that time, it was the single largest major on campus,
Oh.
and you could not get courses. You could not register for communications courses, and there were people who were being forced to spend an extra year or more at the U just to get the courses they needed to graduate. And in the meantime, I had said, well, I'll get a minor. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get a minor, I probably need to be able to speak it. So I decided to do a study abroad in Spain. Went to school at the University of Seville 4 days a week, 4 hours a day, immersed in Spanish and subjects being taught in Spanish. And by the time I got back, I had earned so many credits in Spanish that there was a pretty quick path to a degree
Mm.
in Spanish, and I didn't have to worry about the problem of not getting courses in communications. So
Communications. Yeah.
yeah, so when I got back and I also got a bunch more credit by passing some tests, some CLEP tests, and ended up, with a degree. Did another study in Mexico. Ended up with a degree in Spanish and Hispanic literature. It was the path of least resistance, and something that I really enjoyed. So that's how that happened. I mean, there truly was no plan.
Hmm. Well, things work out though. May not have been part of the plan, but it certainly sounds like it worked out well for you and it helped integrate into everything that followed, which is always a good thing.
It absolutely did. Yeah,
I
without a doubt.
know when I went to UC Irvine starting in the fall of 1968, I entered the year that they had their first graduating class. So the first graduation was
Mm,
for seniors was 69, but they also had graduate school. They had some medical schools and so on. Um, and very quickly, the school had become known for um, science, and a lot of people wanted to go off and become doctors. So the year that I entered, 1,600 people um, enrolled in or enrolled in biology, and they
Okay.
all wanted to go off and be doctors and all that. And the biosci people said, okay, well, before you can really be serious about a biosci major, you're going to have to take a year of organic chemistry.
That weeded a few folks out, didn't it?
From the beginning of my freshman year to the end of my sophomore year, the number of students in biology dropped from 1,600 freshmen to 200 sophomores.
Yeah, that's I think a typical experience with. I took organic chemistry much later in life. It's another kind of part of my winding journey, but I took an entire pre-med curriculum after I finished my PhD,
Mm.
just for pure self-edification. And, I was always troubled by the fact that I got through 3 degrees without really having a good science core. And so while I was working as a professor at a college, I ended up taking, well, all but one course of a pre-med curriculum. And I remember organic chemistry. And I remember just kind of that moment, that realization where you cannot fake this.
No.
You will put in the time or you will not get out.
Well,
I
I
remember
didn't.
that.
I got my master's degree, my bachelor's and master's in physics. So I did not take organic chemistry, but I know everybody was complaining about memorizing all the reactions and all that. And I respect it, but I'm glad I didn't have to take it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, but it was also something that, like I said, it's not something you can fake.
No.
It's a completely different animal than inorganic chemistry. Fascinating, really fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
But definitely requires some mental effort.
I enjoyed hearing people talk about it and enjoyed listening to all of that, but it was different than what I enjoyed doing. And I loved physics and was especially always interested in the philosophy of physics, the history and philosophy. And of course, one of the big debates about physics is it really a quantum and does God throw dice, or is it in reality that there is really determinism? And that's a question that physics still hasn't answered yet. Some people think it has, but it hasn't yet.
Well, and the answer to that question has huge implications for psychology and free will.
Sure, it does.
And all of that.
Sure, it does. Sure. And I am sure that eventually it will all get realized. And, my belief is that there are basic laws of the universe and that there are laws that we have to obey to really progress, but it's our choice. And I am absolutely a firm believer in the fact that there is such a thing as free will and choice.
Yeah, and it may be that we at some point come to some kind of melding of the two, whereby there is some level of free choice or agency, but that's highly influenced by underlying physics principles
Of some sort, correct.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ray Kurzweil, the futurist and inventor, and a man I worked for a few years when he was developing the Kurzweil reading machine, created there is a documentary about him. And at the end, he said, everybody keeps wondering if there is a God. And he said, there isn't yet because we haven't invented it. And I do not buy into Ray's, I don't buy into Ray's argument. That I don't think that works. But it is interesting. But you're right. It all really does come down to, in psychology, a question of free will, a question of so many different things. And eventually we'll understand it.
Well, and there are other related concepts, for example, the notion of growth mindset, which is a really interesting concept. Carol Dweck out of Stanford was the one who kind of popularized this. But the idea that growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset suggests that our futures are malleable, that our ability to learn, to grow, to achieve objectives is at some significant level determined by whether or not we believe that we can grow and change and progress through new talents and perspectives, et cetera, versus the extent to which we believe it's more fixed. and that those limits are kind of innate. And there's a potential physics element to that as well. Having said that, I do believe, and mostly just observation, that it absolutely is possible to grow dramatically, intellectually, spiritually, academically. Some other examples might be things like emotionally, that we are, capable. That's why we have neocortical functions, right? As humans,
Right.
Even separate from other mammals. We have parts of our brain that do stuff,
Right.
that are pretty amazing, and that allow for pretty intense evolution. And I don't mean evolution in the historical sense, although that has its own place. I mean, as individuals,
Right.
The ability to kind of evolve in the context of our environment. So we probably won't have a final answer to any of that before you and I are gone, but it is a topic that I find fascinating.
Oh, I do too. And of course, the other part of the question is, you say we may not have an answer before we're gone. Will we really be gone, or whatever? And so there's that too, right?
Yeah. And I, as part of my own mental health journey, I'm a counselor, but I'm also, in our field, we have this concept of wounded healer. And, I didn't, just randomly pop up one day in, going from being a corporate executive or a university president to being a psychotherapist. I had my own journey as well, a mental health journey. And I put myself certainly in that category of wounded healer. But when we think about, the human experience, right? And as we think about the kinds of things that just either by chance or by purpose end up being part of that journey, for me, being exposed to Buddhist principles and Buddhist thoughts, Buddhist ideas, was really critical in my own healing. And the whole notion of impermanence and afterlife, the Buddhist take on that, I think, is really compelling. And this idea that there is an afterlife, in the sense that we are all comprised of elements and molecules and atoms, that will continue on in multiple forms. And that we're comprised of atoms and molecules that have been around, that were part of someone in the Roman Empire, and part of someone in Greek times, and part of someone on the savannah, or some animal on the savannah millions of years ago. And although it may not be sort of a Christian notion of an integrated afterlife as some version of yourself,
right?
I find that the Buddhist perspective really compelling. This idea that, the energy, the mass, the atoms that comprise us do continue on. And there may, in fact, be some integrated version of that. Who knows? My father passed away a few years ago, and one of the ways that I have grieved that, and one of the ways I have dealt with that loss, is I frequently talk to him. And every now and then I'll ask him, I'll tell him, gosh, I wish he could let me know what happened. Like, so what is it? Where are you? Do you have consciousness? And maybe some way, sometime he'll answer. But for me right now, a big part of that healing and that grieving has been to maintain that relationship with him through conversation.
And should. I believe absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said for the merits of what you were just describing. And the issue, I think, is that if we also go back to what really is God, you've got the Christians who have tried to shape God in the sense in their image more than the other way around. And others have done that too. But the reality is, what really is God? And I think God is the underlying principle for all of us. And I think that we're all part of that God. And so when your father died, or my wife passed away in the end of 2022, they are still there. I love to tell people that I am absolutely certain that Karen monitors me, and if I misbehave, I'm going to hear about it. So I have to behave, otherwise I'm going to be in serious trouble.
Yeah, there's an interesting. I'm just about to finish an absolutely profound book by an author, physician, philosopher. His name is Gabor Mate. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was a child, an infant, actually. The book is called The Myth of Normal. Absolutely seminal, fabulous, fabulous book, just in general, but also resonates with me on my own mental health journey and as a counselor. But he makes reference in the book to the actress Ashley Judd, and a quote of hers, a phrase of hers, which is, I don't want to mess up the quote. It is surrendering to a God you don't believe in. The idea that you don't have to believe in a deity in any sort of codified religious institutional way to still surrender to a sense of a higher power.
Yeah.
And I just really appreciated that quote from Ashley Judd, and I think it's really applicable. This idea that we don't have to be dogmatic, we don't have to be, we don't have to take this institutional approach to surrender to a God we don't believe in. That we can surrender to something bigger, something beyond our own physical existence.
Well, and in the Buddha oriented world, it isn't even a matter of surrendering. It's a matter of believing you're a part of and being willing to progress and grow.
Right.
I can't resist telling one of my favorite jokes, and I've not done it on here before. I used to listen to Hal Holbrook doing Mark Twain Tonight.
Okay.
He
Wow.
did a great imitation of Mark Twain. And I don't know if it was actually Mark Twain that said it, but I attribute it to Mark Twain. But I heard Hal Holbrook say it. He said, when we die, we're going to go to heaven. And when we go to heaven, assuming we go to heaven, we're going to probably be up on a cloud, and we're going to have harp music in the background, and we're going to study. And the more we study, the more we progress. And the more we progress, the more we study. And we're just going to be up there. We're going to study and study and study and progress and progress and progress. And if that isn't hell, I don't know what is.
That sounds like a Mark Twain.
It does sound like a Mark Twain, and I would suspect that it really came from him somewhere. Oh gosh, but the reality is that I think we impose way too many limitations on God and our relationship with God, and it doesn't help us to do it. And I hear what Ashley Judd is saying, but again, I think it's not so much a surrender as it is recognizing you're a part of.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too, Michael.
So what did you do when you graduated from college initially? I'll say the first time. What kind of a career path did you go on to?
Yeah, so immediately I just went to work as a school teacher in a school for at-risk youth in Salt Lake City. I taught Spanish. But I also taught English and introductory algebra and earth science, and a very common kind of thing in small schools. You're a generalist, unlike in large districts where you just teach English all day or whatever.
I grew up and my teachers were generalists.
Yeah, and we also had an intense outdoor program in that school. So it was really interesting. We did snow camping, and we did survival, hikes in southern Utah, just what you could carry on your back, and, through the desert for days. In addition to the schoolwork or the classroom work, which itself was also not very traditional. So, for example, the classes were a mix of ages. I taught classes with 12, 13-year-olds and 17-year-olds in the same class.
Mm.
It was dependent upon, academic inclination, desire to be in a big, particular course. And that school was actually pre-K 12. So, just some amazing, amazing experiences for me and for the students. 30 plus years later, whatever it was, 34, 35 years later, I still remember, I have this image, and it's just such a poignant, touching image, particularly when we think about at-risk youth and at-risk teenagers. I think we don't always have a very charitable view of kids that don't fit in, and adolescents and teens, that oftentimes are considered to be kind of unrefined or self-centered or whatever. And I have this image, I still see it. The school had a downstairs and an upstairs. And I remember one of my students, he was 18 years old. This is back in, gosh, the 80s. And he was, black leather, studs on the leather, jack boots, wallet on a chain. The kid's about, 6'2" and about 190 pounds. The kind of kid that would scare the hell out of a lot of people just looking at him, But I had this mental image of him walking down the stairs, and he's holding the hand of a 4-year-old, helping the 4-year-old down the stairs. I even get a little emotional thinking about it 35 years later. The kind of kid that is so misunderstood, the kind of kid that, has struggled so much to fit in, the kind of kid who, has just constantly been battling between, authenticity and acceptance. And here he is, going down the stairs, holding the hand of a 4-year-old preschooler, to help him get down the stairs. And I just can't imagine a more poignant vision.
Yeah.
And that was, those kinds of things were common experiences for me, in those first couple of years teaching in that environment, after my undergraduate work.
I spent a number of years living in and around, well, I lived in New Jersey and worked in New York, but even before living there, the company I worked for allowed me to travel to sell because we were being so successful, we couldn't just do it all from the phone in Southern California. And so I stayed at a hotel, oftentimes in the middle of New York near Times Square. Mm-hmm. And when I went out at night, there were people, do you remember the old, the Guardian Angels?
Oh, yeah.
So this guy would come up to me and he said, I'm with the Guardian Angels. He said, I just want to walk with you just to make sure you stay safe. And I said, you don't really need to. I'm really good. We said we're going to anyway. And what I've always realized, though, he was good company. He was great. But what I also realized is that in general, if you treat people well and if you don't act like a jerk, then they're going to most likely treat you well as well. And I never did have a problem with anyone in New York. I had a couple people who would come up to me and say, does your dog bite? Because I always had my guide dog.
Right.
And I never knew why they asked. And so my response was, well, he's not trained to do that, but I wouldn't want to be the person to try to find out. Actually the reason I used that answer was my first guide dog was a golden retriever. And one day we were at UC Irvine on campus and some students would bring their dogs to college and then they'd just let them roam. And a bunch of them organized a pack and they actually came after me and my guide dog Squire, who was this wonderful, loving golden retriever. Right. And so we were walking and these dogs were coming up on us from the rear. and Squire jerked away from me. I still had his leash, but he jerked away, so I lost grip on the harness. He turned around and crouched down and growled at these dogs. I've never heard him do that.
Oh, wow.
And they all just stopped and backed up, and somebody else was watching. And he told me later they just walked away with their tails between their legs.
Wow. Yeah.
And, so like I said, it's all about love. But I think it goes both ways. With a dog, I wouldn't want to be the person to try to find out whether if they attacked me, my dog would bite. But I think also it's just as true with people. I'm not quite as sure today with all the drug stuff going on, but the reality is, I think for the most part, people really are going to treat you well if you treat them well.
Yeah, I don't challenge that, Michael. But what I would say is, I think one of the genuine sort of societal problems, manifestations, let's call it, of the kind of polarization and tribalism that's becoming more and more common, is, the deeper that people turn into their own tribe,
right?
The more that people insulate themselves from other people that don't share their views or their background or their culture. I think one of the real potentially profound dangers of this tribalism, and whether it's in social media or where we congregate face to face, and the deep polarization, not just you're wrong, but you're wrong and you're bad, is I think one of the things that we're really in danger of through that tribalism and isolation is that I think we are broadly losing the capacity to navigate conversations, relationships, conflict.
Agreed.
With people that aren't like us.
Right.
And I think that's potentially dangerous.
I think it's absolutely dangerous.
Because that skill, that ability to survive in the face of someone who has very different beliefs, and to get through that without unhealthy conflict, to get through that without casting aspersions, to get through that without personal attacks, I think is critical to kind of a functioning society. Yeah. Because we are always going to have diverse perspectives, diverse religions, diverse cultures, diverse political perspectives. That's always going to be true. So the extent to which we are able to navigate that in a productive way is really critical. And I fear that we are, because we turn towards what we know with tribalism, that we're just losing the opportunity to engage other people who may be quite different than we are and do that successfully. Whereas turning inward to the tribe actually exacerbates.
Well, and there's a lot of truth to that. I guess I'm a little bit of an oddity, even I think among some blind people, in that having never seen, to me, somebody with a different skin color is simply a concept, and it doesn't matter to me about color. And I work very hard to make sure that I continue with that kind of attitude, because it doesn't really matter to me what a person's skin color is, and haven't ever seen different skin colors. And frankly, I know I can say with certainty, I don't care. Now, not everybody necessarily knows me well enough to believe that, but it is still true, because having never seen it, intellectually, I know what red is, I know what blue is, I know what black is, I know what white is. And we can talk about it in terms of wavelength of light too, but it's still not something that becomes an issue for me. And it amazes me when I hear people talking about and demonstrating prejudices about different skin colors and so on, because it's just not something that really is an issue for me, and I'm always amazed by it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make. I mean, just engaging life in general, in the absence of visual stimuli. You obviously are have honed very finely other senses. But this idea, and in our culture, in Western and particularly American culture, it is profoundly visual.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Oh, absolutely. And look, I know blind people who are very prejudiced, and
Yeah.
maybe some of them never saw, but they've learned it. Fortunately, I'm blessed that I refuse to learn that concept.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? I know that we have learned to be incredibly judgmental based upon visual stimuli, right? Is someone short? Are they tall? Do they have acne? Are they overweight? What clothes are they wearing? Do they have the right shoes?
Yeah.
And you may be able to determine some of that through other senses at some point, but you would never initially engage someone based upon that perspective because you wouldn't have it. So a very interesting thought,
And I know my wife, and I also believe my wife was, although she was sighted, never really had that kind of prejudice because she grew up around people of different skin colors and different races and so on. But we would be talking about sometimes political debates, and she would say, well, so-and-so knows about that because he's black. And I would sit there and go, huh? Because I couldn't tell that they were black, and it amazed me, and it didn't change my opinion at all. Now, the fact that he was a politician, that's a different prejudice, but that's another story.
Right.
but they're fun to pick on. But the bottom line is that we've really got to get somehow over some of these things. And I agree with you that the art of conversation, the ability to converse, the ability to really interact with other people is being lost because of so many things. And that is so unfortunate.
Yeah. And I don't want to be Pollyannish, or
No.
oversimplify the situation. I mean, like I said, I was born in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1960s. And there was no need for social media for people to make judgments, to isolate, it was legislated. It was policy. I mentioned, the colored water fountains and bathrooms. So this is not new. This is, that kind of thing has existed in many, many contexts. I think what's qualitatively different today, a couple of things. One is the existence, the medium, mass media and social media have a kind of power that didn't exist before, a platform and an anonymity. You can say things and do things today that wouldn't have been acceptable because you would have been accountable in the past, right? It would have been attached to you individually. So I think that's one change. I think another change is whether we call it, civility or whether we call it norms. I'll be 60 next year, so I've been around for a little while, but not that long compared to some people. But in terms of norms, just in the last, call it 5-10 years, maybe even less than 10, I've been just stunned, frankly, by the things that it's now kind of okay to say and do.
Yeah.
That we just sort of blown through the guardrails, that I think used to kind of exist. It wasn't that you couldn't think it. It wasn't that it didn't exist. It was that there were some sort of norms about what it was sort of okay or acceptable to say or do kind of in a civil society. And I think we've really blown through those guardrails. Social media has helped that. Politics has helped that.
What's one example of that?
Um, yeah. So something that comes to mind is, um, you know, people flaming other people online in social
Okay.
media,
Right.
personal attacks,
Yeah.
particularly when people are vulnerable. If you're face to face, or if you're in a group that's co-located with other people, if you are on the phone even, right? It was much, much harder
Yeah.
to launch those sort of personal corrosive attacks um, on people than it is now. I think in politics, there are politicians now who say things that
Oh, yeah.
that you couldn't say and survive as a politician.
And
You
still
know,
shouldn't, but do. Yeah.
yeah, even 10 years ago, let
Yeah.
alone 2030. And
Yeah.
it's not that politicians didn't think it
No.
or weren't capable, of it. It's just, I think of like criticism of families of war heroes,
Yeah.
or just weird stuff. Like, when did that become okay?
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. Social media has certainly not helped the process.
No, I
Well,
think what it's done is it's anonymized
yeah.
folks, at least in their
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
if not literally.
Yeah. Which is so scary. I hope we grow up and learn, but we'll see. So what, you taught for a while, then what did you go do?
Yeah, so again, I never really had a plan. And I know for some people, plans are helpful, important. They provide security. I truly, Michael, never had a quote plan for anything that happened in my life. I've done everything from teach bilingual kindergarten to run large corporations domestically and internationally. Um, uh, and I just never had a plan. I, I I've taken advantage of opportunities, and I've kind of pursued things that felt exciting or right. Um, uh, but I've never really had a plan. So, after my initial teaching experience, I ended up marrying someone who said, "Look, I'm going to go work in Germany. I have a job over there. And if you want to come, you can come. If you're not, I'm leaving." So we ended up getting married and going over there together. And we're over there for a few years working for the Department of Defense in education roles. Um, and then came back to the US, did some more K-12 work, then went full time into higher education as a professor teaching people to be teachers, as well as Spanish and linguistics. Then moved into the corporate world for a while, came back into higher education, did some senior roles, including president, CEO at a few different institutions of higher education, some in the US, some abroad, and been in the C-suite several times in corporate settings, chief operating officer, chief executive officer. The last kind of formal thing I did working for someone else or working for a board, I guess I would say, was in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, and fascinating, wonderful experience. Just so glad I did it.
Yeah.
From a cultural perspective, from a growth perspective, the hardest job I've ever done as a CEO. Never experienced quite that combination of challenges as a CEO, but just a fabulous experience. And my wife and younger daughter, who's now off away at college, they lived there in the winter and were able to escape in the summer. I was not. 120 degrees and 85% humidity.
Lovely weather.
Yeah, yeah. Winter's stunning, beautiful, but summer's really hard.
Yeah.
And they would come back to the mountains, Colorado in the summer. But and something that's really interesting that happened when I came back from that, and this is kind of interesting. It helps explain sort of how did I go from that to working as a psychotherapist, and I still do consulting work and support organizations with transformational change and leadership and things like that. But so how does one go from the CEO of a company in Abu Dhabi and the president of a college system to going back to school for the fourth time and becoming a mental health counselor? And the short version to that is when I got back from the UAE, I asked myself a very different question for the first time than I would have in the past. So in the past, the question would have been something to the effect of, what's the next job? And I was in a position to have some time off and kind of decompress. And I didn't ask that question. I asked a very, very different question, which was, what do I want to be true in my life? And I had some support with a counselor for that question, and kind of how I kind of fleshed the answer out. And when I had come up with the answer of what I want to be true in my life, it became very clear that I could not do what I'd always been doing and achieve what I wanted to be true in my life. Those didn't align anymore. And so I had to think very differently about what I was going to do going forward. And that was not so ironically the same time that I began to really, really experience some pretty intense mental health challenges, which I had never experienced before. I had never even really experienced anxiety before like that. My experience was so different for so long, 50 plus years. But when it changed, it changed pretty rapidly and pretty dramatically. And I found myself in a situation where mental health and mental health challenges were kind of central. And I really had to figure some stuff out. And so that happened at the same time I was kind of pursuing that question of what I want to be different in my life or true in my life. And what came out of that, in addition to my own kind of healing journey, was this idea that one of the ways that I could achieve one of the things that I wanted to be true in my life was to be in the helping professions and to leverage my own mental health journey to help others, to be, as I mentioned earlier in the call, a wounded healer, which, by the way, is the case for a lot of counselors. A lot of therapists are wounded healers. And so that's how I kind of got to the place of going back to school and being a counselor, and how that decision had kind of the most congruence, the most alignment of probably any life decision I've ever made, personal or professional, in terms of a decision that supported what I wanted to be true. And that started, a little over 3 years ago is when I went back to school. And now, as I mentioned, I've been seeing clients since December 21, still as a student. And then now I have a private practice, and I also work for a community health operation and agency. And I made that choice because I didn't want to be in a situation where a client I didn't want to be in a situation where someone couldn't see me because they couldn't pay. And so that's what community health is. It is a very different environment than private practice. I do both. It is people, court mandated, a lot of alcohol and drug or substance abuse issues, domestic violence, really, really intense challenges. And I love the work. Sometimes it's overwhelming, but it allows me to really contribute in the ways I've wanted to contribute to people who really desperately need it and may not have the means to pursue that otherwise.
Well, you've certainly set your mind and your goals on a lofty, although I don't think an impossible task, but given everything that you've done, it's probably reasonable to say you're going to do a pretty good job of helping to accomplish some of that, or at least make the world better because of it. Um, and that's hard to argue with. I'm really impressed and look forward to seeing how the progress goes. Tell me about the Transformation Collaborative. You founded that.
Mhm.
You also have a couple of LLCs that you've created
Right.
along the way.
Yeah, so the Transformation Collaborative, that was also in that same period of time where I had asked that question, what do I want to be true in my life versus just what's the next job? And it was a really interesting process. It was about 9 months, 12 months, kind of a rotating group of people, just kind of brainstorming, noodling on, if we were going to build a consultancy from scratch based on what we know as professionals, based upon our experience, engaging with consultants, as consumers of consultancy, what would it look like? And we came up with, there was kind of it turned out, through that process, the sort of two driving elements came out of that. One was we probably have to reinvent the consultancy itself because one of the things that kept coming up in that brainstorming conversation stuff was that the traditional, particularly the big consultancies, that traditional model is just woefully inadequate much of the time. It's overpriced. It's superficial. It's on the outside. I won't go into details about all the things that are broken with it, but basically, what happens is an agency, has a couple of meetings. They put together a report. They throw it over the wall. They have a celebration dinner. They go on to the next client. There's no sense of accountability. There's no role in execution. I'm not talking ever, just broadly. So the first thing we decided is, you know what, if we're going to do this, we're not going to do it that way. In fact, we refer to ourselves as embedded partners. We don't call ourselves consultants. Our goal is to really, to play a role in getting the client from A to B, including actually providing labor, bandwidth, accountability, execution. So that's the first thing that was very different. And also different in terms of how we operate. I told you previously before we were on the air, we don't have non-disclosure agreements with our partners. We don't have, non-competes. It's very different. We don't skim off the top. We don't take commissions, none of that stuff. It's a very different model. The second thing that we determined as part of that process was, if we're going to really bring value and we're going to be doing what we want to do, we want congruence between what we're doing, what we want to do. It really can't be about incremental stuff. It can't be transactional. It can't be, help with a computer program or, help with a compliance issue. There are lots of folks that do that, lots of agencies that do that. They do it really well. But if we were going to be embedded partners and if we were going to be doing what we wanted to do, it had to be transformational. It had to be supporting organizations to reinvent themselves for the world they're in, not the one they were founded in.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two things came out of that process, and that's what the Transformation Collaborative is. There's two main things we do. One is supporting organizations through some version of reinvention, transformation, innovation. And the other is leadership. We are pretty kind of harsh in our assessment of what we view as leadership deficiencies, even leadership crisis, in many organizations today. And so we've developed a model for kind of the competencies and traits that we believe are required for leaders to be effective today. And more importantly, we've developed a program to support that. And we don't call it leadership development because we feel like that's also not what this is. That's
a buzzword.
It's a buzzword. And I think it's also a little bit even tainted because so much of leadership development is about the wrong stuff. we refer to it as leadership discovery. And the way the program operates is we support leaders in discovering themselves as people, as leaders, as identifying elements of that skill set and traits that they can gravitate towards, and really develop, or not develop, but can really leverage. Let's use that word, to be more effective. And I'll just give you just a really quick example. We're of the mind that leadership is rarely anymore about technical skills. It's rarely about, a leader's own labor. All the stuff that's been traditional leadership stuff is just price of entry now. If you aren't, skilled with P&L, if you, can't work well with a board, if you don't have basic management skills, then that's a very different problem.
Yeah.
And we see kind of the primary role of leaders today, in addition to facilitating change and transformation, is human capital. The idea being that everything else is a commodity. Financing, technology, you name it. That's all has a very short shelf life. But as a leader, if you can develop powerful human capital in your organization, that's not a commodity. That's a deep competitive advantage. And it's about ensuring that your organization is successful because you make other people successful.
Yeah.
Not because you are an individual rock star with your technical skills or business savvy.
Interesting. One of the things that I used to do when I managed and led sales teams and people in companies is I always would say to them, I hired you because I know you can do the job, but at least you sold me on the fact that you can do the job. Some people did a better job of selling and didn't necessarily be as successful as I would have liked, but that's okay. But my job isn't to boss you around. My job is to work with you to figure out how I can add value to make you more successful. And the people who got that and who were willing to work on that with me were successful. And we figured out what each other's skills were. And sometimes I taught them things that they didn't know, and it went both ways. But we worked together and they were more successful. It's all about collaboration.
Yeah, it's collaboration, and a big element, and the collaboration is part of that. In our view, at the Transformation Collaborative, a big chunk of that human capital piece. It's not just leveraging labor. In fact, that's the last thing. That's the last thing it is. What it's about is, in fact, we eschew terms like employees, labor, workforce, workers, because we feel like that commoditizes the people who can potentially bring value in the organization.
Yeah.
It's our belief that if leaders can engage the people in their organization as human beings, if they see the workforce as humanity, and that's as simple as that is, you will not hear leadership development organizations say that or say it that way.
No.
But if leaders can see people in their organization as humanity, and can address them as such, and can see them as human beings who don't stop being human at the office door. It's not easy. It's hard to put on a spreadsheet. It's a long-term proposition. But if an organization truly wants to be sustainable, if they truly want to outgrow or grow at a rate greater than the competition, it is not going to come from commodities like their next technology or even their access to capital. It's going to be, do they have people in the organization that are fully engaged, that are committed to the organization because they feel valued and taken care of. That's, again, it sounds very simple. That's not language you typically hear in a conversation like this.
No, and it's not necessarily easy to make happen, but if you do it and you learn how to do it, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. I have heard many people say that they really love their job to the point where it's not a job anymore. It's a labor of love. It is what they love to do. Mm-hmm. And I think as a leader, part of my responsibility is to help people explore that opportunity with whatever they're doing. And the ones who truly discover that they love what they do will do the very kinds of things that you're talking about.
Yeah. And, one of the things that kind of is frustrating to us, if not even confusing to us at the Transformation Collaborative, is the extent to which, again, sometimes we take kind of a harsh position, but the extent to which people should kind of know better are either just doing the wrong thing or clueless.
Yeah.
And one of the big organizations, one of the big consultancies that we still have a lot of faith in is Gallup. And that's because they have such massive data sets.
Yeah.
And they really get it in terms of the people piece. They really, really get it in terms of the human piece. Employee engagement, detachment continues to decline. From 4 years ago, it continued. The data is just in for 2023. And they continue to feel lower levels of satisfaction,
mm-hmm.
And less connection to mission and purpose. And as a result, they are more and more disengaged. And that's just profoundly expensive to organizations.
Yeah.
To have these huge payrolls of people that are disengaged. And
they don't get it. And
yeah,
they don't get it.
Yeah. And the data is there, right? And folks are communicating what's not working for them.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward.
But people aren't listening.
Exactly. Yeah. And, people, they don't feel like they have clarity in what's expected. Their managers are not giving them good feedback and coaching. They might be managing time and resources, but they're not developing their people. No one asks anyone's opinion about contributing to goal setting or improvement or innovation. They don't feel like the organization gives a rat's ass about their well-being, their sense of purpose, being part of a team. I said in a recent LinkedIn post just a few days ago, this is not rocket science. I put in all caps, which I almost never do. Mm-hmm. This is not rocket science. And yet there are so many leaders that just seem baffled by what's going on. And kind of one of our goals at the Transformation Collaborative with our leadership discovery program is to really, really get leaders over that hump, and help them develop a completely different perspective. Now, you said it's not easy to do, and that's true, but it's not just because it's a new approach, new skill set,
right.
New way of thinking, not just because organizational structures and compensation and culture doesn't necessarily support it. But it's also really hard because even if you're that kind of leader, that behavior is not traditionally rewarded for you as a leader.
Right.
Like, it doesn't fit well into the, performance, reports to the board on the fourth slide of the PowerPoint. It's, it doesn't fit well into short-term results. And so to do that as a leader takes a tremendous amount of courage, and it's a really big risk because you will be speaking a language that many people around you do not speak, that people you report to do not speak. and that has not been traditionally rewarded. So
Yeah,
it's you're right. It is very hard to do for multiple reasons.
I hear you. You know what? We have been going almost 70 minutes, and I'm going to have to end because we have been going almost 70 minutes.
Yeah.
But I think we should do another one of these.
I'd love to. In fact, I know that a whole bunch of the questions we kind of talked about
I know
beforehand, we didn't even
we
get
didn't
to.
even get to. So I would
You
like
know,
to, yeah.
I'm totally fine. I love that. You know, these are the kinds of conversations I really, really enjoy, Michael. I don't think we do enough. You know, one of the things that I talked about, what I want to be true in my life and what have I changed and whatever. Um, I dedicate a lot of time now to engagement, interactions, connections that I can't monetize,
Mm-hmm.
that aren't about deliverables, that don't connect to some performance goal, but just are nourishing.
Yeah.
Just
And
and I
that's
feel,
worth a lot.
yeah, and I feel that's kind of what today's been. So I really appreciate that opportunity.
Well, if people want to reach out to you, maybe talk with you further or consult or use your efforts and so on, how do they do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do that. If they want to go poke around on the Transformation Collaborative website, then they'll see a lot of stuff about, research we've done, things we've published, trends, services we provide, both with transformation and leadership discovery. They can just go to transformationcollaborative.net. It's all one word, transformationcollaborative.net. They can see the team, all the affiliates, just kind of poke around and see what's there. And they can reach out to us. There's a contact form, phone number, email, all that stuff. And that's the Transformation Collaborative piece. I also have a personal website where I do a lot of writing. That's where also the information is for me as a counselor, as a mental health counselor is. And that's just Wallace K. Pond, all one word, wallacekpond.com. So either one of those places people can go and mess around. And if you want to reach out and talk to someone, fire away, and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Cool. Well, I hope people will reach out. I definitely want to do another one of these, and we will set that up forthwith. But I want to thank you again for being here, and I want to thank all of you for listening. This has been fun, which is the rule of Unstoppable Mindset. You got to have fun if we're going to do it. And I think Wallace and I have had fun, and I hope you've had fun listening to us. If you'd like to reach out to me, I would sure appreciate it. One thing I'll ask is please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. We love those ratings, especially when they're 5 stars. And we'd also just love to hear any thoughts that you have about today. You can reach out to me at Michael, MICHAELHI, at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to my podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Michael Hingson is spelled MICHAELHINGSON. Love to hear from you. If you know anyone who ought to be a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, I would appreciate hearing about that. And Wallace, of course, you as well. If you know other people that we ought to have on, then I really would love your help in finding them. But I want to thank you all again for being here and being a part of our podcast today. And Wallace, one last time, thank you very much for being here.
You're more than welcome. Thank you so much, Michael. I've enjoyed it and look forward to doing it again.